Marianne Kwan was 59 years old, yet she retained the alert poise of someone who had spent her entire adulthood balancing on a financial high wire. One misentered digit could topple a corporate empire, and in her hands, those digits always marched in precise formation. Halifax's winter light seeped through the double-paned windows of Armitage and Blackwell, washing the open office in a pewter glow that made every chrome monitor stand look faintly aquatic. Marianne's corner desk, however, was a sanctuary of warm order. A polished walnut organizer arranged pens by ink weight. A bone-white mug, gifted by an intern, steamed with oolong that carried the ghost of Osmanthus. And beside the keyboard sat a photograph of Sabrina Ling Kwan at age 6, her velvet hair fraying from twin braids as she clutched an origami crane her father had folded. That small square of childhood anchored Marianne's entire universe, a reminder of promises whispered on the day Henry Kwan's heart failed mid-stroke while teaching Sabrina to paddle roll on Lake Bannock, promises that his wife would shoulder every dream their daughter dared to imagine, no matter the cost. So when Tuesday's email slid in with the courteous chime outlook reserved for priority contacts, Marianne expected the usual confetti of decisions, whether to upgrade the Jose to a Central Otago vintage, whether the quartet should shift from Vivaldi to Debussy for the bridal ingressional walk along the glass pier jutting over Lake Wakatipu. She had already wired $37,000, each one spelled out on a receipt she kept folded in a velvet pouch beside Henry's old compass, to lock the cedar and glass Aoraki estate, whose floor-to-ceiling panes reflected the remarkables in a way that made the mountains appear to kneel and bless the water. Another $63,000, timed to leave her personal savings account the following Monday, would pay for suspended lanterns, farm-to-table degustation, and bespoke accommodation for 80 adored guests. Sabrina had thanked her effusively last week in a voice note sprinkled with emojis that sounded like summer rain. Yet the body of this new message detonated in Marianne's chest with the muffled thump of snow sliding from a roof. "Hey, Mom! After a really heartfelt convo with Callum's mum, we've decided to keep it super intimate, like under a dozen people. We'll set you up with a live stream link so you can still soak in the vibes, lol." 3 letters, LOL, burrowed like frostbite under her ribs. They shrank 32 years of single mother over time, of mac and cheese dinners eaten cold while proofreading Sabrina's science fair boards, of night courses in forensic taxation taken, so her daughter never had to fear a late tuition fee, into digital confetti tossed by a thoughtless thumb. The hum of the HVAC faded. Keys clacked like gulls beating against distant water. And Marianne saw, with excruciating clarity, that somewhere between ballet lessons and graduate school tuition, she had been recast from mother to benevolent financier. She inhaled once, steadying the tremor that threatened to shatter the oolong surface tension, typed 4 measured words. "Sure, enjoy your day," and pressed send. Closing the laptop felt like lowering a casket lid. She slipped into her charcoal raincoat, the lining still faintly scented with sea salt from daily harbor walks, and stepped onto Hollis Street, where a fine Atlantic drizzle freckled the worn brass buttons and blurred the city into watercolors. As she walked toward the public gardens, the stones beneath her boots clicked out a rhythm she had not heard since Henry's funeral procession, a rhythm that murmured of endings, yes, but also of revolutions that begin, quietly, with the recognition that a human soul is never a line item to be approved or declined. The drizzle followed Marianne down Barrington Street and across Spring Garden Road, beading on the charcoal wool of her hood and darkening the leather of the satchel that bumped her right hip with every purposeful step, yet she scarcely felt the cold, because her mind replayed the email in an unbroken loop, each syllable of Sabrina's super intimate LOL scraping her nerves raw. It was only 6 blocks to Jubilee Road, but those 6 blocks stretched like a corridor of memory, past the bakery where she used to buy cinnamon buns for a ponytailed Sabrina after Saturday swim lessons, past the florist whose owner once slipped her a wilting lilac stem for free when she mentioned Henry's birthday, past the law office whose brass plaque still bore the name of the partner who had first hired Marianne for weekend bookkeeping 3 decades earlier, launching the career that would eventually bankroll every one of her daughter's dreams. By the time she reached her narrow, red-brick row house, its facade half hidden behind the leafless beech that Henry had planted the spring they moved in, her raincoat clung to her like a second skin, and the faintest tremor had settled in her fingers. Not from cold, but from the sudden comprehension that something foundational had shifted inside her. A plate of maternal bedrock sliding with tectonic inevitability. She unlocked the door and stepped into a hush thick with beeswax and cedar polish, resisting the instinct to flick on the light so the February twilight could first seep into every corner and paint the familiar rooms in shades of pewter. To the left, the dining table still bore the subtle scorch mark from the night 1 decade earlier, when she had overbroiled lasagna while fielding dual client calls about a cross-border tax dispute. To the right, the staircase creaked softly at the 7th tread, the exact spot where an 11-year-old Sabrina had once perched cross-legged, quizzing Marianne on Latin prefixes for a regional spelling bee. Farther back sat the upright piano, its mahogany lid closed tight since Henry's aneurysm, though Marianne could swear she still heard the echo of his faltering lullaby chords in the dusty twilight air. She shrugged off her raincoat, hung it on the carved mahogany stand, a bargain Henry had unearthed at an estate sale in Lunenburg, and allowed her palm to rest on the worn curve of its top finial, as though it might steady her balance in this suddenly reconfigured life. With deliberate slowness, she crossed to the mantel and lifted the silver-framed photograph that anchored the household mythos. Henry, mid-laugh on a rented sailboat off Mahone Bay, salt spray dotting his glasses as Sabrina, gap-toothed and fearless, mimicked the captain's salute. "We made it work, didn't we? And you," she whispered, the Vietnamese term of endearment Henry had loved, though her accent had always amused him. The silence that flooded back felt neither accusatory nor consoling. It was simply vast, like deep water waiting to be charted. Something inside her clicked then, an audible internal vault door thudding shut, and Marianne turned toward the roll-top desk beneath the front window, the one she had long promised would be the place she would finally write poetry once she retired. She drew up the timbre, revealing a leather-bound ledger where every personal transfer was recorded in looping fountain pen script. There, in neat sepia ink, the upcoming Monday entry sparkled. 63,000 New Zealand dollars, Aoraki estate final balance. Her waterman pen hovered, its nib glinting like a scalpel, and then sliced a bold diagonal through the line, the excess ink pooling at the stroke's foot like a full stop heavy with intention. She closed the ledger, aligning its spine precisely with the desk's edge, and dialed the bank's after-hours cancellation line. While the hold music, an anodyne saxophone rendering of a forgotten pop ballad, spooled through the receiver, she filled the kettle, noting the lime-scale ring near the spout, and set it to boil. The operator finally answered, her voice bright with scripted empathy, and Marianne verified her identity, cited the transaction code, and requested immediate termination of the pending wire. Her tone was not clipped or angry. It was level, serene, as though she were adjusting an audit figure to reflect reality rather than emotion. "Yes, I confirm full cancellation," she repeated, each syllable settling into place like ledger entries reconciled at month's end. The kettle clicked off just as she ended the call, and in that same breath her phone pinged, a new message from Sabrina, festooned with digital confetti, gushing about sablefish canapés at the menu tasting. The incongruity jabbed like ice under a fingernail. Marianne set the device face down, poured oolong into the bone-white mug, its cracked glaze forming a subtle map of hairline rivers, and carried cup and saucer to the bay window. Outside, the street lamps had flickered on, casting cones of golden light that turned the wet asphalt into liquid bronze. Rivulets of snowmelt threaded between parked cars like capillaries, while distant foghorns groaned across the harbor. She sipped, the floral bitterness blooming across her tongue, and recognized the quiet that surrounded her, not as loneliness, but as spaciousness, a hard-won interior acreage where her own pulse finally echoed free of obligation. In that resonance she understood, body, blood, breath, that love offered without respect was simple philanthropy, and philanthropy without gratitude was indistinguishable from debt collection. The tremor in her fingers stilled. Even the tiny spoon beside the saucer lay motionless, as if the entire house had rotated to a new, unerring center of gravity, one in which Marianne Kwan, widow, mother, accountant, and now unequivocal steward of her own worth, would no longer be rendered a line item on anyone's balance sheet. At dawn, when the overcast sky above Halifax was the color of unpolished pewter, and the Atlantic air smelled faintly of kelp, Marianne woke to the insect-like trill of her mobile vibrating across the maple nightstand, a persistent, almost frantic rhythm that seemed determined to infiltrate the fragile quiet she had won for herself only hours earlier. She did not reach for the device at once. Instead, she allowed those insistent pulses to form a distant metronome, while she performed the small grounding rituals that had carried her through nearly 2 decades of widowhood. She folded back the tartan quilt Henry's sister had sent from Glasgow the winter after his death. She slipped her feet into woolen slippers whose heels were worn thin from pacing during late-night audit seasons. She padded to the ensuite and washed, her face with rose-scented soap, watching the water bead and slide across the laugh lines that Sabrina used to trace with her fingertip when she was still small enough to believe her mother indestructible. Only then did Marianne return to the nightstand and turn the phone face up, revealing a constellation of missed calls, voicemails, and text messages, all from Sabrina, time-stamped in escalating intervals throughout the wee hours. She pressed play on the first voicemail, half expecting to hear anger, perhaps even contempt. But what greeted her was a breathless whisper, thick with the sort of panic Marianne had last heard when Sabrina rang from university to confess she had failed organic chemistry. "Mom, please, I think something's wrong with the transfer. Callum's accountant says the funds never landed. Could you call me as soon as you get this?" Each successive message grew more frayed. The second was an anxious apology. "I'm sorry if the email sounded harsh. I'm just under so much stress." The third teetered toward accusation. "Our entire date could be lost because of a banking glitch." And the fourth, left just before sunrise, dissolved into tearful pleading so raw it trembled through the speaker like the cry of a seabird caught in storm wind. Marianne listened to them only once, then archived them with the same efficient gesture she used to file closed casework. The texts were worse. Digital confetti of exclamation points and crying face emojis begging for clarity, promising future gratitude, offering nothing that resembled true remorse. And Marianne scrolled until the screen's brightness felt intrusive, then set the phone face down on the kitchen counter beside the rose-gold kettle that was already beginning to hiss. She was measuring oolong leaves into a porcelain gaiwan when the doorbell rang, one sharp peal that reverberated through the high ceilings and sent the houseplants trembling in their clay pots. Marianne knew, even before she opened the door, that the visitor would be Julian, her younger child by 3 years, the perpetual mediator who had inherited Henry's stoic frame and, regrettably, some of Sabrina's entitlement. He stood on the stoop with rain still stippling the shoulders of his navy field jacket, eyes flashing the storm cloud grey that announced indignation before his mouth even opened. "Mom, what on earth happened? Sabrina is hysterical." "Callum's family is saying the wedding might have to be postponed, and she told me you cancelled the final payment." His voice struck the hallway walls like thrown gravel. Marianne stepped aside, refusing the defensive posture she might once have adopted, and gestured him toward the living room where the morning light pooled in muted silver. She did not invite him to sit. "Julian," she began, her tone the even cadence she employed when correcting balance sheets. "I did cancel the payment. It was my money committed under the assumption I would be treated as more than a remote observer." Her son's brows knit, the gesture so reminiscent of his father that a ripple of tenderness threatened to soften her resolve, but she stood firm. "Mom, you are making this about yourself," he insisted, pacing before the piano as though the ghost of its last chord still hovered. "Sabrina's email was poorly phrased, sure, but withholding funds now is cruel." That final word hung between them like a gauntlet. Marianne inhaled, feeling the teakwood floor cool against her slippered feet, and replied, "Son, cruelty is expecting unconditional financing while explicitly denying the financier a seat at the table. I have given freely all my life, but I will not subsidize my own erasure." Julian stopped pacing, shocked by the steel in her voice. "They need that money, Mom," he said, but the sentence lacked conviction, and Marianne saw the realization dawn behind his eyes. For the first time, his mother's boundaries were not a negotiable line item. "Need and entitlement are not the same," she answered gently, "and neither outweigh respect." A moment of charged silence spiraled outward, broken only when the kettle whistled in the kitchen, sounding uncannily like a referee's final call. Marianne inclined her head toward the door. "I have to get ready for work, Julian. We can speak when everyone is ready to discuss this as adults." Her son opened his mouth, thought better of it, then nodded once, an awkward, stiff gesture, as though accepting terms of surrender he could not yet articulate. He left without further protest, pulling the door shut with a softness that felt both tentative and irrevocable. As the latch clicked, Marianne returned to the kitchen, poured the hot water over the waiting leaves, and watched them unfurl, tight fists loosening into elegant tendrils. Steam rose, clouding her glasses, and she understood with a startling clarity that the very act of expansion required heat, pressure, and time. Her children might one day bloom into gratitude or wither in their resentment. Either outcome was no longer hers to engineer. She carried the gaiwan to the small writing desk overlooking the garden, opened a blank page in her journal, and began to draft a proposal, transmuting the cancelled $63,000 into seed funding for a community program offering pro-bono financial advocacy to older women facing economic abuse. Outside, the drizzle softened to a fog, wrapping the budding magnolia tree in pale gauze, and Marianne felt, for the first time since Henry's last heartbeat, that the morning was entirely, gloriously hers. The fog had scarcely lifted from the harbour when Marianne stepped into the lobby of Armitage and Blackwell, but the reception alcove already thrummed with pre-market chatter, associates murmuring about Asian indices, paralegals clutching lattes like life preservers, yet every voice seemed to subside as she crossed the marble floor, a hush that always followed the firm's unofficial compass. She greeted the security guard, a retired submariner, who had once told her that her punctuality reminded him of tide tables, and rode the lift to the second floor, where row upon row of frosted glass offices reflected the dawn in fractured silver. Only the senior partners and Marianne possessed private rooms with genuine walls. Hers, anchored by an antique barrister bookcase and a broad window overlooking the restless water, smelled faintly of sandalwood from the drawer sachets she replaced. Each season, she had barely hung her moss-green trench on the coat peg when a junior analyst darted in, cheeks flushed. "Miss Kwan, there's a woman in reception. Says it's urgent. Family matter." The phrase family matter slid through Marianne's gut like a shard of ice, but she merely nodded, smoothing the charcoal silk of her blouse before sweeping down the corridor. Sabrina stood near the sculptural ficus in the waiting area, her usually sleek chestnut hair tangled, eyes rimmed in the puffy carmine of a sleepless night. She wore a cashmere wrap the color of clotted cream, but its luxury only heightened the aura of disarray. A single glance told Marianne that her daughter had not come for reconciliation. Desperation clung to her like static. "Mom," she began, voice wobbling between pleading and command, "I need 5 minutes." Marianne inclined her head toward an unoccupied conference room whose glass walls bore an etched pattern of waves. Chosen, employees joked, to remind clients that financial storms were survivable. Once inside, Sabrina closed the door with a shaky hand, then rounded on her mother. "The venue will release our date by tomorrow if they don't receive the balance. Callum's parents are furious. I have been calling every hour. Why aren't you answering?" The words tumbled out like dice, each one revealing another facet of panic, yet none showing contrition. Marianne folded her hands atop the polished walnut table, feeling its reassuring solidity. "I am at work, Sabrina, a place where I am addressed with respect. If you wish to speak to me here, that same respect is required." The steel in her tone stunned Sabrina into momentary silence. Then came the bargaining. "Okay, yes, I should have called instead of emailing, but you know how stressful wedding planning is. Look." She fumbled in her handbag and produced a trifold brochure. "This is the tasting menu and the florist sketches." "I wanted your opinion." Marianne studied her daughter, noting how the lines of entitlement and anxiety warred across her face like tide marks after a storm. "Opinion," she echoed softly. "You wanted my funds, Sabrina, not my presence. Those are distinct currencies, and I have decided to transact only in the latter from now on." Sabrina's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. In that pause, Marianne continued, her voice low, not unkind. "You will marry perhaps in a vineyard, perhaps in a backyard, and it will still be your day. What it will not be is another ledger of my sacrifices." She allowed that truth to settle, then added the kernel she knew would shatter any illusion of leverage. "Furthermore, our Aki estate belongs to a portfolio group whose lead counsel is one of our firm's long-standing clients. I could, with a single courtesy call, request an extension or expedite the processing of any late fee. But today, I will not." Hope flared in Sabrina's eyes at the first half of the sentence and died by its end, leaving behind a stunned vacancy. "Mom, you can't mean that," she whispered, voice thin as cracked porcelain. "I mean exactly that," Marianne answered, "not out of vengeance, but preservation." A rap sounded on the glass. Robert Armitage himself, briefcase in hand, reading the tableau with a tactful nod. He cracked the door, his baritone gentle yet firm. "Miss Kwan, we need you in the morning debrief in 10. Everything all right here?" Marianne rose, smoothing her blouse. "All is well, Robert." "We were just finishing." Sabrina's shoulders slumped, recognizing dismissal, yet something in her expression shifted. Perhaps the first glint of comprehension that her mother's authority extended far beyond the checkbook into networks of influence. Sabrina had never bothered to map. As Robert withdrew, Marianne gathered the abandoned brochures into a tidy stack and slid them back toward her daughter. "Take these," she said. "Design the celebration you can truly afford, financially, emotionally, ethically. When you are ready to rebuild this relationship on mutual respect, my door will be open." Sabrina's lip quivered, but she collected the papers with trembling fingers. I don't know if we can fix the venue in time," she stammered. "Then consider a ceremony on Callum's grandparents' land," Marianne suggested, recalling a forgotten detail from a past conversation. "Wild lupines bloom there in late spring. It could be beautiful, intimate in the truest sense." The idea seemed to catch Sabrina off guard. For a heartbeat, raw vulnerability softened her features. and she looked suddenly like the child who used to press wilted dandelions into Marianne's palm. But fear resurfaced, hardening her gaze. Without another word, she turned and left, heels clicking like punctuation down the hallway. Marianne watched her daughter's silhouette diminish through the frosted glass, feeling neither triumph nor regret, only an uncanny stillness, like the air between waves. 6 minutes later, she sat in the partner debrief, presenting a concise risk analysis of a pending merger, her voice steadier than ever. Yet beneath the ledger lines and projections, a new budget was taking shape within her heart. One that measured wealth not in outbound wires, but in the hard, luminous currency of self-respect. 2 months slipped by, like quiet tides along the Halifax seawall, and on a slate-skied Wednesday, the kind that smelled faintly of wet granite and distant kelp, Marianne's newly christened Harborlight Initiative opened its doors in a refurbished brick storefront on Argyle Street, formerly a shuttered antiques shop that still bore ghost letters of a Victorian sign beneath the fresh paint. Inside, amber pendant lamps cast warm halos over birchwood desks donated by a local carpentry guild, while a mosaic of sea glass tiles, Sabrina's childhood collection, repurposed with bittersweet resolve, glimmered along the reception counter. Marianne had spent the past 8 weeks weaving every thread of her forensic expertise into this place, drafting intake protocols that would translate complex legalese into plain speech, securing a modest pro bono budget from the partners at Armitage and Blackwell, and recruiting a rotation of volunteer actuaries, mediators, and retired family court judges, all women, all intimately acquainted with the quieter forms of financial violence that can mute a life from within. At precisely 9:30, the frosted glass door swung inward and the first client entered. Anita McPhee, a 73-year-old Métis artisan who had spent 4 decades weaving star blankets, only to discover her late husband had remortgaged their trailer against an offshore investment scheme. Anita's hands trembled as she laid faded statements on the consultation desk, but Marianne met her gaze with a steadiness forged from her own recent crucible, and in that exchange, a silent promise that neither would ever be reduced to a balance sheet. Again, the Harborlight Initiative flickered fully to life. By noon, the waiting area hummed with low voices and the aroma of nutmeg muffins delivered by a neighboring cafe in solidarity. Marianne floated between rooms like a conductor, her charcoal blazer traded for a jade-green cardigan, whose sleeves she pushed to the elbows as she annotated spreadsheets and translated liens into living English. Near mid-afternoon, as gulls circled the rooftop vents, Julian's name pulsed across her phone screen. She hesitated, aware that boundaries must still hold, but answered, stepping into the narrow garden courtyard out back where ivy curled up weather-softened brick. Julian's voice was subdued, almost reverent. "Mom, I wanted to tell you first. Sabrina and Callum have decided on a ceremony at his grandparents' farm outside Mahone Bay. They're calling it a lupine blessing in early June. No vineyard, no orchestra. Just a few friends, some barbecue, and, well, family, if you want to come." The words tumbled out like pebbles into still water. Their ripples carried both invitation and apology, though pride prevented either from being named outright. Marianne rested her palm on the sun-warmed sill, watching a honeybee navigate the clustered buds of a climbing rose. "That sounds lovely," she said evenly, "but attendance depends on more than a date and location. It depends on respect acknowledged and repaired." "I will consider it." There was a pause. Julian's exhale sounded like wind threading pine needles. Then a quiet, "I understand." He added, almost in a whisper, that Sabrina had taken a second job at a design cooperative to repay Callum's parents the down payment. When the call ended, Marianne slipped the phone into her cardigan pocket and stared up at a patch of sky the color of hammered pewter, feeling neither vindication nor reluctance, only a calm sense that choices were finally aligning with consequence. Evening gathered in layers of violet and indigo before she locked the front door of Harborlight, the brass key clicking home like a final ledger entry. The interior, now silent, retained the faint buzz of lives recalibrated. Anita had left with an actionable repayment plan and the direct number of a pro bono litigator who understood both treaty rights and predatory lending. Marianne dimmed the pendant lamps one by one, their filaments fading like sunsets behind mountains, and walked the 7 blocks home, passing storefronts that winked with reflected streetlights. Outside her row house, the beech tree Henry had planted stood bare but unbowed, its knotted limbs silhouetted against a waxing crescent moon. Inside, Marianne brewed oolong in a porcelain gaiwan, carrying cup and saucer to the writing desk, where the magnolia buds now swelled fat as silkworm cocoons. On a fresh page, she recorded Harborlight's first-day metrics: 5 consultations completed, 3 follow-up actions scheduled, $0 charged, and beneath that, she wrote a single sentence for herself: wealth measured in reclaimed dignity, a cruise, compound interest beyond any spreadsheet. She set down her pen, sipped the tea, and listened to the house breathe around her. The steady tick of the mantel clock, the distant drip of thawing eaves, even the faint hum of the street lights beyond the drawn curtains. For the first time in many years, those layered sounds blended into a melody that asked nothing from her, yet returned everything. Proof that when one banks on self-respect, the dividends arrive in moments of unassailable quiet. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning washed in the nacreous light of early May, Marianne arrived at Harborlight before the city's cathedral bells tolled 9, letting herself into the quiet stillness that smelled of lemon oil and sun-warmed brique. In the intervening days, the initiative had grown with improbable velocity. Retired banker Martha Doucet now held weekly debt triage clinics. 2 graduate students from Dalhousie's law faculty logged affidavits for women contesting covert mortgage. Lienz and a local radio host had aired a 10-minute segment that cast Harborlight as the compass for those navigating the shadow currents of financial abuse. Marianne pinned that quotation, printed in indigo ink, to a corkboard already blooming. With thank you notes written in careful cursive by clients whose lives were tipping back toward equilibrium. Yet beneath every accolade pulsed a private ache, for Sabrina's silence had stretched from days into a fortnight, and even Julian's updates, delivered in clipped but hopeful texts, had dwindled to little more than photographs of lupine shoots pushing. Through coarse pasture soil, Marianne pressed her palm against the board's wooden frame, feeling its grain beneath her fingertips, and reminded herself that growth, whether botanical or relational, followed no ledger's timetable. At 11, as gulls wheeled above the rooftop vents, Harborlight's front door creaked open, and a slim young woman in a dove-grey trench stepped hesitantly across the threshold. Her face was partially hidden by a soft felt hat, but the moment she raised her chin, Marianne's breath caught. It was Sabrina, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, yet bright with a resolve Marianne had never quite seen in her daughter. In one hand she clutched a brown craft envelope thick with papers, in the other a small bouquet of violet lupines bound by twine. For several heartbeats they regarded one another, the quiet punctuated only by the tick of the reception wall clock and the muffled drone of traffic beyond the frosted glass. Then Sabrina spoke, her voice rough as gravel, yet steady. "Mom, I have something to show you, and something to ask." Without waiting for assent, she laid the envelope on the birch reception desk and slid out its contents. A ledger of her own, hand-drawn columns listing hours worked at the design. Cooperative. Payments made to Callum's parents, and projected savings goals for the coming year. Every number, written out in words, as Marianne once taught her, was accompanied by a line of explanatory notes, some stained with what looked suspiciously like late-night coffee. I want you to see that I understand value now, Sabrina whispered. Not the price of venues or flowers, but the worth of presence and the cost of taking it for granted. She paused, swallowing. I cannot repay the decades you carried us, but I can shoulder my share of the future. Marianne traced a fingertip along the wobbly, flourished handwriting. 640 hours of graphic layout, $4,008 repaid, 800 earmarked for an emergency fund, and felt a tremor of something wider than forgiveness bloom in her chest, equal parts pride, relief, and that tender astonishment reserved for the moment a sapling roots itself deeper than a storm can. Fell. She looked up to find Sabrina watching her with an expression raw and undefended. These lupines, her daughter added, lifting the bouquet, are from the first patch to bloom on the farm this season. They are an invitation, but not a demand. If you choose to come, I will greet you as my mother first, not my financière. If you choose not to, there will be a seat left empty in acknowledgement of the lesson you taught me. The words, stripped of ornament, shimmered with sincerity. They were the opposite of that careless loll, the antonym of dismissal. For a long, aching moment, Marianne weighed silence against speech, understanding that whichever she chose would reverberate far beyond the courtyard ivy or the Argyle Street cobblestones. At last she reached for the bouquet, its stems cool and slightly damp, and inhaled the faint, peppery sweetness that always reminded her of Henry's aftershave and summers spent picnicking near tidal pools. Growth, she said quietly, echoing her earlier reflection, is rarely linear and often painful. But today I see the direction of yours. She did not say yes, nor did she say no. Instead, she extended one arm and with careful gentleness folded her daughter into an embrace neither of them had risked in many months. Sabrina's shoulders sagged in grateful release, and in that fragile circle of shared breath, Marianne felt the metrics of her own heart recalibrate, aligning with a new equation in which dignity and mercy need not be mutually exclusive entries. When Sabrina finally pulled back, tears shining on her cheeks, Marianne gestured toward the ledger pages still spread across the desk. "Leave these with me," she said, voice soft but assured, "and return in 1 week. We will review your projections together, line by line, hope by hope." Sabrina managed a watery smile, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and nodded. As she left, the door chimes rang a clear, deliberate note that seemed to linger long after her silhouette vanished into the spring afternoon. Marianne stood alone amid the hush, lupines cradled in her hands, and felt the subtle shift of seasons both external and within. Outside, clouds parted to reveal a disk of pale sun, and inside, Harborlight's sea-glass mosaic caught that light, scattering shards of color across walls that had once known only shadow. 1 week later, beneath a sky the color of raw silk and a wind that carried the green salt tang of the harbor into every downtown alley, Marianne unlocked Harborlight precisely at 8. The lupines Sabrina had brought now standing sentinel in a glass pitcher on her consultation desk, their violet spires already beginning to tilt toward the morning sun. The day's docket held 6 appointments, yet Marianne's pulse quickened, not for those meetings, but for the final entry penciled at 4 o'clock, S.L. Kwan, Budget Review. Since their encounter, Sabrina had sent no pleading texts and no guilt-laced calls. Instead, at exactly noon each day, she had emailed a single screenshot, proof of another shift completed at the cooperative, of another small payment toward the farm. Ceremony of another line in her ledger where projected hope had been replaced by earned reality. Each message closed with the same 3 words typed plainly without emoticon or flourish. Respectfully, your daughter. It was not contrition performed for applause. It was apprenticeship in accountability, and that distinction warmed Marianne more than any bouquet could. By midday, the office hummed like a beehive. Anita returned with 2 newly bound star blankets and an update that the predatory lender had accepted revised terms. Martha's debt clinic overflowed into the hallway, where volunteers served tea in chipped sea blue mugs, and the graduate students scurried between printers, the scent of fresh toner trailing like a banner of industry. Still, whenever the front door chimed, Marianne's gaze lifted instinctively, and she caught herself smoothing the sleeve of her dove-grey blazer, an unconscious echo of her mother awaiting parent-teacher conferences. Finally, 4 strokes past 4, the brass knob turned and Sabrina entered, hair swept into a low knot, cheeks wind-flushed from the brisk walk across Argyle Street. In her arms she carried the ledger folder and a slim laptop, but no flowers, no gifts. She had learned the difference between tokens and testimony. Marianne led her to the consultation table, where side-by-side monitors usually parsed decimal jungles. Today they would map something rarer: growth. They began with the raw figures. Sabrina opened spreadsheets titled Lupine Wedding Budget and Future Self-Fund, each cell tinted in soft lilac, each number written out in full words: $723 for locally sourced food, $1,080 for a weatherproof marquee, $840 reserved for unexpected contingencies, and Marianne nodded, pleased by the buffer. They cross-checked receipts, verifying that every commitment had a corresponding revenue stream. Extra freelance hours, laying out bilingual signage for the city transit revamp, weekend shifts running silkscreen presses at the cooperative, even a tiny income trickle from selling digital patterns inspired by Henry's old sailboat sketches. Sabrina's voice, once quick to crescendo into complaint, now held the measured cadence of someone learning to respect silence between statements. She paused often to invite critique, corrected her own slips before Marianne could, and, most telling of all, never once glanced at her phone. When they reached the final tab, Marianne saw a column labeled Harborlight Contribution, populated with zeros. Sabrina followed her gaze. "I wanted to ask," she said quietly, "if there's a role here I could fill. Not to repay, but to participate." She explained that the design cooperative allowed a flexible schedule, that she had recently completed an online certificate in accessible document formatting, and that she could donate 2 evenings each week to produce client-ready infographics translating legal jargon into plain language posters. "Economic dignity starts with comprehension," she added, echoing a phrase Marianne had coined in a conference interview. The words struck deep. They were the first proof that Sabrina was listening not only to her own crisis, but to the wider symphony Harborlight sought to conduct. Marianne closed the laptop, folded her hands, and let a long breath settle between them like dust motes in a sunbeam. "The initiative could certainly use such a skill set," she said at last. "But more importantly, are you offering it because you believe in the mission, or because you believe it will buy my approval?" The question hung, luminous and sharp. Sabrina did not flinch. "Because I believe in the mission," she answered, "and because I finally understand that approval cannot be transacted." Marianne felt something unlock within her chest, not the vault door snap of severance, but the quiet click of hinges returning to alignment. She reached for a blank volunteer form, slid it across the table, and watched as her daughter filled each line with steady pen strokes, signing at the bottom with full legal name, date written out, the 1st day of June, 2025, and a signature that wavered only on the final flourish. When the paperwork was filed, Sabrina folded her hands the way Marianne often did, a mirror of learned composure. "About the ceremony," she began, voice low, "there will be a seat for you beneath the old chestnut tree. No reserve sign, just space. I hope you will choose it." Marianne pictured the farm, rolling grass, violet spires nodding in salt-sweet breeze, a chestnut casting dappled patterns like lace across linen tables. She imagined Henry's compass in her pocket, its needle swinging toward true north, not of geography, but of integrity. She met Sabrina's gaze, saw hope mingled with humility, and allowed herself a small, unambiguous nod. "Then I will see you there," she said. "As your mother, walking on my own 2 feet, carrying no check but plenty of love." Sabrina's exhale trembled, half sob, half laughter, and she rose to embrace Marianne with arms that no longer clutched but simply held. Outside, the cathedral bells began to toll 5, their bronze voices spilling through open windows like benediction, and within Harborlight's sea-glass mosaic, the late sun sparked indigo, amber, and violet, each fragment a testament that broken things, when reset with care, can refract the light more brilliantly than any flawless pane. The days that followed unfolded with the deliberate grace of a slow-turning compass, each dawn shading gradually towards summer, as if time itself were honoring the measured cadence Marianne and Sabrina had at last agreed upon. In Harborlight's airy rooms, the rhythm of transformation quickened. On the first Monday of June, Sabrina arrived for her inaugural volunteer shift, carrying a recycled canvas tote, bulging with color swatches and typography guides, and by twilight she had converted Anita McPhee's dense loan settlement contract into a 3-panel infographic so lucid that even Martha Doucette, who had once audited multinational ledgers on Wall Street, declared it more elegant than a balance sheet sonnet. On Tuesday, Marianne hosted a roundtable for community leaders, outlining a blueprint to replicate Harborlight's model in 3 additional maritime towns within the coming fiscal year. And as she watched Sabrina quietly rearrange the folding chairs, afterward, checking that every backrest aligned flush with the wainscoting, Marianne felt a subtle lift in her chest, a sensation not unlike the first tug of tide beneath a sailing vessel eager to leave harbor. Wednesday brought a spring squall that rattled downtown window panes and sent gulls somersaulting in the pewter sky, yet inside the initiative the atmosphere remained luminous. Sabrina set up a makeshift photo booth against the brick wall so clients could leave with a newly printed piece of identification, a tiny shield against bureaucratic invisibility. And when one widow clasped the card to her chest, murmuring that it was the first time in 15 years she had seen her own name spelled correctly, Marianne noticed her daughter discreetly blink away tears and hand the woman a cup of chai sweetened with condensed milk, Henry's favorite comfort drink. On Thursday, Julian dropped by with a stack of cardboard boxes labeled farm supplies and confessed that he too had begun budgeting lessons at Sabrina's cooperative. The sibling banter that sprang up in Harborlight's hallway, good-natured, teasing, free of old triangulations, was so startlingly gentle that Marianne stepped back into her office to breathe in its echo, letting it reroute neural pathways long mapped for conflict. By Friday, with the lupine ceremony only 8 days distant, the week's accumulation of small mercies coalesced into something more substantial, like scattered raindrops fusing into a rivulet. Marianne rose early, cinched her stone-colored trench, and walked the length of the waterfront before work, passing fishermen unloading crates of silver flash herring, while coffee vendors lured morning joggers with the promise of cardamom kissed. Espresso. The air tasted of brine and possibility. She paused near Pier 23, where Henry had once lifted a toddler Sabrina onto his shoulders so she could wave at departing cruise passengers, and she imagined the scene that awaited beneath the chestnut tree. Burlap runners, mason jars of wildflowers, perhaps a string quartet coaxed into trading Vivaldi for an East Coast fiddle reel. She wondered if Sabrina might stumble over her vows, or if Callum, lanky and earnest, would tuck a stray curl behind her daughter's ear the way Henry used to do for her on windy ferry decks. The weight of longing folded gently into anticipation, an emotion Marianne realized she had not permitted herself since before Henry's final heartbeat. She withdrew his brass compass from her coat pocket the same heirloom she had kept locked away since the email rupture, and when she clicked open the lid, the needle quivered northward with unwavering intent. She smiled, recognizing it as both direction and benediction. At Harborlight, she placed the compass on her desk, a silent proclamation that guidance could be inherited, but purpose must be chosen. And as volunteers filtered in, Sabrina among them, cheeks ruddy from the same sea wind, Marianne announced a new initiative. Compass scholarships, microgrants funded by the remainder of the would-have-been venue payment, each earmarked for women seeking certification in fields that translated resilience into remunerative autonomy. Sabrina's hand was the first to shoot up with design suggestions for the application portal, and in that moment, Marianne saw initiative rather than entitlement flash in her daughter's eyes, a light bright enough to outshine any chandelier in a distant vineyard dining hall. That evening, after ledger sheets were filed and the office darkened save for the violet glow of the sea glass mosaic, Marianne lingered to straighten the lupines in their pitcher, noting how every stem now reached eastward, orienting toward the first light of morning. The metaphor was almost too on the nose, yet she accepted it tenderly, then slipped into the soft dusk of Argyle Street, heading home beneath street lamps that stitched golden commas into the gathering narrative of her life. In the quiet house on Jubilee Road, she brewed jasmine tea, opened her journal, and began drafting a brief toast for the ceremony. No flourishes, no fiscal metaphors, simply a testament to the fact that love, like any sound investment, must be nourished by trust and audited by humility. She wrote until the clock chimed 11, then pressed the tip of her pen against the final period and whispered into the lamplight, "We are solvent." Outside, a breeze rustled the magnolia leaves, and inside, Marianne closed her eyes, picturing a chestnut tree ready to shade an unreserved chair she would not hesitate to claim. 1 week before the ceremony, as June's first heat shimmer unfurled over Nova Scotia like transparent gauze, Harborlight's normally measured hum rose to a bright crescendo of preparations that seemed to echo the mounting heartbeat of the lupine. Wedding itself, and Marianne, moving through her initiative's birch-lined hallways with clipboard in hand, felt almost as though she were navigating the rigging of an old schooner. Each volunteer a sail catching wind, each client session a taut rope, demanding steady hands. Yet beneath that orchestration, her private thoughts threaded inexorably toward the chestnut tree in Mahone Bay. In the reception alcove, Sabrina trimmed fresh sprigs of sea lavender for the waiting room vases, humming an impromptu medley of folk tunes, while her laptop rendered printouts of simplified power of attorney forms, and at her feet lay a cardboard box. Stenciled femme decor, handle with hope, containing twine-wrapped mason jars, thrifted lace runners, and a tiny hand-lettered sign that read, "Choose a seat, not a side. We're all family, once the vows are tied," a phrase Sabrina admitted she had. Workshopped a dozen times to avoid sounding either saccharine or coercive. Martha Doucette, ever the logistician, had commandeered the corner office as a makeshift inventory hub, its floor now crowded with second-hand lanterns, hay bale throws, and rows of cobalt blue enamel mugs destined for cider service. She reported, with the brisk satisfaction of closing a financial quarter, that every item had been sourced through barter or donation, leaving the wedding ledger still safely in the black. Meanwhile, Julian, who had surprised all by mastering envelope budgeting in mere weeks, practiced a speech beside the sea glass mosaic, rehearsing the cadence of the line, where he would welcome guests to a celebration rooted in soil, not spectacle. And each time he stumbled over the word spectacle, he laughed, a sound Marianne had not heard from him since childhood afternoons spent building kites on the back deck. Even the building itself seemed to participate. Sun poured through the transom windows, scattering kaleidoscopic fragments of amber and violet across the polished floors, so that every step Marianne took left her skirt momentarily ablaze with moving. Color. By mid-afternoon, the buzz spilled into Argyle Street as Sabrina and a trio of cooperative colleagues loaded decor boxes into Julian's borrowed cargo van. A gust of the harbour lifted loose lupine petals into the air, and for one fleeting instant, the petals swirled like confetti around Sabrina's dark hair, casting her in a purple constellation that made passers-by pause with small smiles before continuing on their errands. Marianne watched from the doorway, hand wrapped around Henry's brass compass, and felt a quiet click inside her chest, as though the instrument's needle had aligned not with a magnetic pole, but with the dual coordinates of forgiveness and pride. When the van finally rattled away toward Mahone Bay, trailing a ribbon of laughter and window-rolled folk music, she returned indoors to lock the day's files, pausing at her desk to review the Compass Scholarship Fund statements. 5 applications, already approved. The first stipend issued to a former fisheries plant worker enrolled in a bookkeeping course. The fledgling program gaining momentum with a speed that suggested the universe's fondness for virtuous feedback loops. At 5:30, she powered down the office, lifting the now sun-wilted lupines from their pitcher and cradling them gently as she walked the 7 blocks home, their fading violet infusing her palm with the faint fragrance of pepper and dew. On Jubilee Road, the beech tree rustled in a breeze heavy with honeysuckle, and Marianne paused by the gate, picturing Henry in his khaki windbreaker, binocular strap slung across his chest, calling out seabird species, while Sabrina tugged at his hand, demanding another shoulder ride. Memory lapped at the evening like tidewater against pilings, but for once it brought no ache, only the soft pressure of continuity. Inside, she laid the spent lupines on the compost pile, brewed jasmine tea, and spread the final wedding budget across the dining table. Every item balanced, every cell cross-checked, a testament to the algebra of earned resilience. She drafted a brief email to Sabrina, subject line Chestnut Tree Logistics, requesting the exact timing of the ceremony so she could coordinate travel with Harborlight's Saturday walk-in clinic, then signed off simply, "With love, Mom." Before bed, she slipped the compass beneath her pillow, its cool brass calming her pulse, and whispered a promise to the darkened ceiling. In 7 days, she would walk into a clearing of lupines, not as a benefactor reclaiming lost equity, but as a mother witnessing her child step into a marriage built, at last, on the twin ledgers of gratitude and grace. By the time dawn bled coral streaks across the Saturday horizon, a hush had settled over Halifax's waterfront, broken only by the muffled slap of tide against barnacled pilings and the distant cry of kittiwakes greeting the day. Marianne rose before the mantel clock chimed 6, slipping from beneath the linen sheets with the quiet precision that had once allowed her to study tax codes while Sabrina and Julian slept down the hall. In the kitchen, she brewed oolong in the celadon teapot Henry had bought at a street market in Saigon during their honeymoon, its glaze still crazed with delicate crackles that looked in low light like a map of unnamed rivers. She sipped slowly, letting the steam warm her face, and reviewed the itinerary she had drafted the night before. Drive to Mahone Bay by 9, meet Julian at the farm gate to help arrange the aisle of salvaged church pews, confirm the acoustic trios. Arrival, then retreat to the weathered guest cottage for 1 hour of solitude before guests began filling the meadow. Beneath each bullet point, she had scrawled a reminder in violet ink. Breathe, notice, receive. 3 imperatives she repeated under her breath like segmented prayer beads as she packed. Her suitcase was light, a sage green silk dress that brushed her calves, a pair of low-heeled ebony pumps resilient enough for grass, Henry's compass nestled in a velvet pouch, and, folded with exacting care, the dandelion yellow linen scarf, Sabrina, used to knot around her child's shoulders on field trips as a talisman for visibility. Marianne hesitated, then added the scarf atop the dress, telling herself it might serve as a bright dash of something borrowed, something remembered. Before zipping the case, she tucked a slim blue notebook into the side pocket. A ledger of sorts, but one filled with short verses she had begun scribbling during lunch breaks, each poem tracing the contours of regained self-worth. She suspected Henry would have teased her gently for taking up poetry so late, yet she felt his tacit encouragement in every half-rhymed couplet. At 7 precisely, she locked the Jubilee Road door, paused to rest her palm against the beech tree's ridged bark, and whispered a single word: forward. The drive south was a ribbon of silver highway flanked by spruce and granite outcrops where pockets of early fog lingered like snoozing cats. Marianne rolled down the window, letting pine-scented air tangle her hair, and cued the playlist Julian had sent her. Folk fiddles interleaved with gentle piano, a soundscape both root-bound and feather-light. 40 minutes in, her phone buzzed with a text from Robert Armitage. "Good luck today, Ms. Kwan. Harborlight holds down the fort. Focus on joy." The message startled a laugh from her throat. Even in his stoic formality, Robert had mastered the well-timed benediction. The Mahone Bay farmstead came into view just after 8:30. Rolling pasture hemmed by stone walls, a clapboard farmhouse with paint peeling in artful curls, and, dominating the distant rise, the great chestnut tree whose canopy spread like an open palm against the blue. Julian was already waiting at the gate, sleeves rolled, grin wide as the horizon. He tapped his wrist theatrically. "You are 3 minutes early, Mom. Your reputation remains intact." Then handed her a travel mug of cardamom coffee and directed her toward the barn, where pews rescued from a decommissioned chapel awaited their new congregation. They worked in companionable quiet, sunlight slanting through haymow beams as they hefted each pew onto a low trailer hitched to the farm's elderly tractor. Julian, perspiring but upbeat, narrated trivial facts: how the pew wood was red oak, how the carpenter's chisel marks suggested a 19th century origin, how lupines thrived in acidic soil because they fixed nitrogen in their roots, and Marianne found that every seemingly idle detail soothed her nerves like a familiar lullaby. Near 10, the acoustic trio arrived, a fiddle, a cello, a low whistle, and set up beneath a buttercream canvas awning. The first strains of rehearsal drifted across the meadow, twining with the sweet grass scent, until Marianne felt the music resonate in her sternum. She excused herself to the cottage, finding within its cedar-panelled walls a simple brass bed, a basin, and a small mirror framed by driftwood. She changed into the sage dress, looped the dandelion scarf loose at her neck, and fastened the compass on a slim chain so it rested over her heart. Drawing the blue notebook from her bag, she penned a final poem of 8 lines, each line beginning with the word "let," each ending with "begin," then closed the cover as if sealing a pact. A knock sounded. Sabrina. She entered hesitantly, athwart the doorway in a peppercorn linen robe, hair pinned but not yet veiled, cheeks flushed more with emotion than rouge. For a heartbeat they regarded one another, mother in green, daughter in nascent bridal white, mirroring versions of timid wonder. Sabrina broke first, stepping forward to take Marianne's hands. "They're ready to start seating," she whispered, "but I wanted to say, whatever happens beyond those doors, today is possible because you taught me to audit my heart." Tears trembled unshed on her lashes. Marianne pressed their foreheads together, breathing the mingled scents of peony shampoo and salt wind. "Then let's begin," she murmured, feeling beneath her fingertips the quick drum of Sabrina's pulse, its cadence echoing her own. Together they walked into the meadow, where pews waited like open arms and lupines tilted skyward. Violet sentinels bearing witness to the balance finally struck between generosity and grace. The meadow theatre had been gradually filling for the better part of an hour, first a trickle, then a gentle tide, until nearly 75 chairs and reclaimed pews, now polished with beeswax and dappled by the chestnut's green-gold canopy, held an audience that hummed like shoreline surf. Marianne took her seat, second row, aisle side, between Julien and Martha Doucette, the latter beaming with pride at every lantern she had rehung when early breezes proved friskier than forecast. It was 2:30 when the acoustic trio struck the first slow reel, the cello's low heartbeat letting the whistle braid keening ribbons overhead, and in that instant the assembly's chatter fell into reverent hush. Callum emerged from the farmhouse porch wearing a linen waistcoat the colour of oyster shells, a single white lupine pinned to his lapel. His steps down the burlap runner were deliberate, almost counted, as if each pace were an answered prayer for patience. Behind him walked 3 attendants, friends from his engineering cohort, carrying enamel mugs of cider to set upon a barrel altar they had built at dawn. Then the runner cleared, and the cello hushed to a tremolo. Julien touched Marianne's hand, whispering, "Now," and the whistle modulated into a soft, expectant line. Sabrina appeared at the top of the slope, arm hooked lightly through her grandfather's tall walking staff, repurposed as ceremonial baton since her own father was gone, and her gown, more ivory than white, rippled like kelp beneath moonlit water. Instead of a veil, she wore the dandelion scarf Marianne had packed only hours before, its sunshine brightness wrapped turban style to hold back an errant breeze. When the crowd caught its warm hue, an audible sigh rippled forward, as if yellow itself were the herald of forgiveness. Every step she took seemed to gather the clover's scent, so that by the time she reached Callum's side, the entire clearing smelled of honey and salt, and Marianne felt an almost audible click inside her ribs, muscle memory of cradling her infant daughter when the world still fit within a nursery window. The officiant, a retired provincial judge whose docket once intimidated half the city's startups, welcomed the assembly with a story about lupines, how the flowers stubbornly reclaim depleted soil by giving more nitrogen than they consume, and how marriages, too, must feed what they wish to harvest. Vows followed, Sabrina's voice ringing clear on promises to value presence above presentation, Callum's cracking as he swore to honour the currency of listening, and each was sealed not with rings alone, but with a hand-pressed wax stamp bearing a compass rose, an emblem Sabrina had chosen after discovering Henry's heirloom hanging near her mother's heart earlier that morning. When the judge pronounced them married, the trio shifted into a jig. Pews emptied as guests funneled toward a hay bale reception, ringed by trestle tables draped in lace runners. Marianne lingered at the chestnut trunk, fingertips tracing its whorled bark, letting jubilation swirl past her like brook water. Julien reappeared bearing a mug of spiced cider and coaxed her into the revel, where she circulated among neighbours, co-workers and Callum's relations, who thanked her, without calculation, for safeguarding Sabrina's steadiness through storm years. At twilight's hem, under lanterns glowing amber as fireflies, Julien clinked a cobalt mug for attention. His toast, once rehearsed to the point of brittleness, flowed now with unstudied grace. He spoke of soil that remembers every footfall, yet gives new roots an unmapped welcome, and of mothers who balance ledgers invisible to the world until interest compounds into miracles. Laughter and wet eyes answered him, and when his final benediction landed, "Here's to choosing a life solvent in joy," Marianne felt the compass pendant twitch, as if Henry himself had said amen. Finally, Sabrina beckoned her mother forward, placing 2 cork-stopped bottles upon the barrel, one filled with Mahone Bay seawater, the other with rain she had collected during the April downpour that nearly cancelled their lupine seeding. "Tide and storm," she announced, "both necessary for bloom." She poured a measure from each into a hammered copper bowl, then held it out. Marianne met her daughter's eyes, wide, steady, utterly devoid of guile, and dipped her fingers into the mingled waters, flicking droplets toward the chestnut's roots, the way Vietnamese elders cleanse doorway thresholds at New Year. Gasps turned into applause, and in that note of shared release, Marianne stepped close, enfolded her daughter, and whispered the three-word refrain that had anchored every line of her secret poems. Breathe, notice, receive. Sabrina's shoulders shook. Once, joy, not grief. And as mother and daughter parted, the lamps overhead glinted off the compass, rose stamped in wax upon her vows, its north point razored toward a sky now spangled with the first brave stars of early summer. Night settled over the Mahone Bay farmstead like velvet stitched with silver, and lantern light pooled across the meadows so softly that every dew bead on the clover seemed to ignite, as though the earth itself refused to dim the celebration. Long after the final fiddle tune quieted, and the last slice of blackberry buckle disappeared from the trestle tables, and after gatherings simmered beneath the chestnut tree, pockets of guests exchanged slow stories while nursing enamel mugs filled now with cocoa and a dash of rye, and the newlyweds, barefoot, Callum's waistcoat slung over Sabrina's shoulders, wove from cluster to cluster in a lazy infinity loop, repeating thank yous until gratitude felt as natural as breath. Marianne lingered near the barrel altar, tracing the worn compass pendant that lay warm against her collarbone, absorbing the sweet smoke aroma of the small driftwood bonfire Julian had coaxed to life. Sparks coasted upward, like tiny comets seeking their constellations, and with each ember that vanished into the indigo sky, Marianne released another private ledger of worry, that Harborlight might falter without her constant oversight, that Sabrina's epiphany would prove temporary, that grief for Henry would ambush her beneath every milestone she witnessed alone. Around her ankles the grass still glimmered where she had flicked the mingled storm and tide water. Dew hugged each blade, turning the ground into a mirror of the night above, and in that reflection she saw an older woman, clothed in sage silk and dandelion linen, shoulders drawn not by burden, but by a posture of earned ease. Callum's mother, Elaine, a marine geologist with wind-pink cheeks, approached carrying 2 linen-tied bundles. "Leftovers," she murmured, pressing one into Marianne's hands, the fabric already cooling in the night air. "For your volunteers on Monday. Sabrina says you feed the hungry spirit as well as the hungry belly." The compliment, offered without calculation, landed gentle as snowfall. Marianne thanked her, fingers brushing the embroidered initials on the cloth, C&S. In that script she sensed no deficit demanding payment, only abundance freely shared, and she felt the faint click of a boundary becoming bridge. Nearby, Julian practiced waltz steps with Marta, the dead clinic maven, humming a tune somewhere between a lullaby and a ledger closing, their silhouettes flickering in bonfire light like archival footage spliced with new film. When Sabrina broke from a knot of guests and drifted toward her mother, Marianne noted how her daughter's strides had changed. Gone was the tentative sway of someone measuring worth by external approval. Here walked a woman who understood that the surest balance comes from the muscles of self-accounting. Together, they walked a short distance beyond the lantern glow, stopping where the meadow met a quiet rise of spruce. The world hushed there, except for crickets and the faint slap of harbor water against distant rocks. Sabrina exhaled, fogging the cool air, then spoke with a steady cadence. "I know the work of one season does not erase the deficit of many years, but I want you to hear this while stars are listening too. Every monthly budget will now carry a line titled Legacy Contribution, and that line's revenue will be measured in actions, not currency, volunteer hours at Harborlight, free design work for the Compass scholars, small kindnesses invested where returns can never be tallied." She reached into her pocket and produced a tiny brass token etched with a lupine and a compass rose intertwined, Callum's modification of Henry's emblem, then pressed it into Marianne's palm. "A promissory note," she added, "payable in perpetuity." Marianne closed her fingers around the warm metal, eyes stinging not with hurt, but with something bright and inexhaustible. She flashed on Henry's voice, soft yet unwavering, narrating tide tables for a young Sabrina on a long-ago kayak trip. Everything returns, everything renews, and understood that those words, once half memory, were now manifest in the loop of brass between her hand and her daughter's. When at last the guests drifted toward cars and cottages, Marianne remained beside the dying bonfire until only coals glowed like a pocketful of garnets spilled in the ash. She tamped them safe with river sand, whispered a quiet "thank you" to the tree that had sheltered both ceremony and reconciliation, and joined Julian for the short walk to the guest cottage. Inside, moonlight pooled on the quilted coverlet, and on the nightstand lay Sabrina's ledger, returned with a ribbon and a note. Audited and approved. Love, Mom. Marianne slipped the book open to the final page, where she had earlier penciled a single line meant for her eyes only. Under the soft glow of a hurricane lamp, she amended the sentence, transforming it into a stanza that read, "Balance is breath, interest is grace. When love keeps the books, all losses embrace." She closed the cover, heart ticking in even meter with the distant surf, knowing that tomorrow she would awaken in a cottage scented with salt and lupine, drive back to a city where Harborlight's lamps awaited first light, and step once more into the arithmetic of ordinary days, days fortified now by the knowledge that her worth, her children's worth, and the worth of every woman who crossed Harborlight's threshold would never again be subject to the crude valuations of unchecked entitlement. Outside, a lone owl voiced its decree, and Marianne, already half dreaming, answered in a whisper that tasted of oolong and chrysanthemum. Accounts settled, stories open. Sunrise crept over Mahone Bay like a cautious painter, testing soft brushstrokes of coral and pearl along the horizon before committing to full color. Inside the cedar-paneled guest cottage, Marianne woke to birdsong and the faint, briny hush of waves colliding with distant granite. For a long, luxurious moment, she remained still, cataloguing the small sensations that proved she occupied a body finally at rest. The linen sheets cool against her calves, the fragrance of lupine pollen lingering in her hair, the gentle ache in her forearms from hefting chapel pews that now belonged to memory rather than obligation. She rolled onto her side and found Henry's brass compass on the nightstand, its lid ajar as though even through the night it had kept watch, verifying that north remained true. Propped beside it lay Sabrina's tiny brass token, lupine twined with compass rose, catching a spear of early light and throwing a miniature sunspot onto the wall. Marianne traced the engraved petals with her thumb, marveling at how swiftly symbols could evolve. What began as an heirloom of navigational certainty had become a shared dialect for dignity. After washing her face in the enamel basin, she wrapped the dandelion scarf around her shoulders and stepped outside. The air tasted of salt and wild mint. Dew jeweled every strand of meadow grass, tiny prisms bending the new sun. From the farmhouse chimney drifted a ribbon of wood smoke, rich with the promise of coffee. She followed the scent to find Callum at the outdoor fire pit, coaxing embers beneath a blackened kettle. He greeted her with that earnest half-smile she now recognized as sincere humility, not charm. Without preamble, he poured 2 tin cups of dark roast brood strong enough to glimmer like obsidian. "Mother Kwan," he said, using the title with shy respect. "Thank you for yesterday. Sabrina told me the only reason our ledger balances at all is your insistence on teaching her the mathematics of accountability." Marianne accepted the cup, letting the heat seep into her palms. "She taught herself," she corrected gently. "I merely withheld the answer key until she showed her work." Callum laughed, a sound like wind flirting through pine boughs, and raised his cup in salute. Back inside the farmhouse kitchen, the wedding party had transformed into an impromptu assembly line. Julian and Martha whisked pancake batter, while Elaine sliced strawberries the color of rubies. Sabrina, wearing an oversized flannel and bare feet, manned the griddle, flipping each pancake with a flourish that sent buttery steam curling to the rafters. When she spotted her mother, she executed a theatrical bow with spatula over her heart. "Mom, official audit, please. Are these golden enough?" Marianne inspected the neatly stacked discs, noting the uniform browning. "Grade A assets," she pronounced, and the room erupted in a chorus of good-natured groans at the accounting pun. They ate at long plank tables dragged from the barn, passing bowls of maple syrup tapped from trees on the property, and for once conversation meandered without the undertow of hidden expectation. Talk of lupine seed propagation, of Harborlights. Expansion blueprint of Callum's plan to develop tidal energy prototypes using recycled fishery equipment. Nothing about venue deposits or trust funds, only futures built from shared sweat and bright-eyed speculation. After breakfast, Sabrina produced a bundle of blank craft tags, each punched with a twine loop and a mason jar of indigo ink. "Guestbook, version 2, she announced. "Write a lesson, a wish, or a fragment of wisdom. We'll hang them on the chestnut branches. The tree will archive our story." Marianne hesitated, the tags cardboard toothy beneath her fingertips. Around her, others scribbled lively maxims. "May your arguments be brief and your apologies lavish. Compost your regrets into wild flowers. Budget for adventure." Marianne uncapped the fountain pen Henry had gifted her the year Sabrina turned 8, its nib worn by decades of ledgers, and wrote in deliberate strokes, "Generosity gains compound interest only in the account of gratitude." She tied the tag beside Julian's, which read simply, "Keep receipts of kindness." The chestnut's lower bough soon fluttered with paper leaves, each inscribed hope rustling together like a communal heartbeat. By late morning, goodbyes streamed through the meadow in a steady current. Guests hugged, exchanged phone numbers, and loaded pews into the borrowed cargo van for return to their donor chapel. As she clasped Elaine's hands one final time, Marianne pressed the leftover bundle of blackberry buckle into her friend's arms. "For your next research voyage," she said. Elaine nodded, eyes bright. "And for Harborlight, seismic resilience is your specialty." With that, the geologist joined the departing convoy, leaving swirling dust motes glowing in sunlit beams. Only immediate family remained to tidy the last traces of celebration. Sabrina and Callum dismantled the burlap runner, laughing whenever the breeze threatened to reorder their neat folds. Julian gathered spent lanterns, their wicks fragrant with yesterday's flame. Marianne lingered at the tree, gently lifting each wisdom tag and running her finger along the twine knots to ensure they held. She thought about Harborlight's Monday schedule, Anita's follow-up mediation, the first Compass Scholar orientation, Martha's new loan forgiveness workshop, and felt no anxiety, only anticipation. As noon neared, she retrieved her suitcase from the cottage porch. Sabrina hurried over, breathless, holding a small wooden box carved with a compass on its lid. "For you," she said. Inside, nestled among velvet lining, lay a ceramic mug hand-painted with lupines and the phrase, "Interest in Grace," in Sabrina's looping script. Marianne chuckled softly. "My new balance sheet," she mused, closing the lid with care. They embraced, a hug steady, unhurried, more like an exchange of ledger signatures than an emotional plea. Julian joined, making it a familial triangle. Over their shoulders, Callum saluted with 2 fingers and started the farmhouse pickup, ready to shuttle newlyweds to their short coastal honeymoon in a rented lighthouse. The drive back to Halifax traced the same ribbon of highway, yet felt altered by another layer of intimacy, like rereading a ledger whose debits had been forgiven. Windows down, Marianne let spruce-scented air churn through the car, the compass pendant tapping lightly against her sternum with each curve. At Harborlight's Argyle Street storefront she parked, choosing to unlock the office even on a Sunday. Dust motes danced in sun shafts. The sea glass mosaic kindled in afternoon light, greeting her like an old confidante. She set Sabrina's compass box on her desk, unlocked the filing cabinet, and placed the brass token, a promissory note of actions, beside Henry's compass. One artifact of fixed north, one of earned course. She whispered to the empty room, assets aligned. And there, framed by the quiet, she began outlining Harborlight's next quarterly report, not in columns of dollars but in metrics of reclaimed agency, hours donated, contracts simplified, boundaries fortified. Each new line promised dividends far richer than interest rates could measure. Outside, gulls rode thermals above the harbor, their cries slicing the warm blue world open wide, and Marianne felt her chest echo the sound, an exhalation of certainty that tomorrow, and every tomorrow thereafter, would tally up in favor of those who learned that self-respect is the only currency that never devalues in the marketplace of love. 6 months slid past like polished driftwood on the Bay of Fundy's long tide, and by late December, Halifax glittered beneath a glaze of rime so fine it turned every street lamp into a chandelier. On an evening crowned by an indigo sky and a half-grown moon, Marianne locked the glass door of the original Harborlight office, now designated headquarters, then climbed the creaking staircase to the repurposed loft, where she liked to compose year-end reflections. The loft smelled of cedar beams and clove-studded orange peels drying for tomorrow's solstice workshop. Bundled against the chill, she set her leather folio on an oak trestle desk, whose top was crowded with hand-thrown mugs, compass tokens, and a miniature brass plaque reading Harborlight Initiative, where dignity compounds. Through the dormer window, she watched snowflakes swirl like loosened punctuation, rewriting the night into elegant silence. It struck her that she no longer measured quiet by the absence of crisis, but by the presence of potential, and that subtle recalibration felt as seismic as any corporate merger she had shepherded in her former life. She opened the folio to the quarterly report drafted earlier that week. The figures, transcribed in deliberate words rather than numerals, unfurled across thick cream pages. 108 women counseled into debt relief, 74 predatory liens overturned, 3 new Compass scholarships awarded to certify. Apprentice electricians, mid-career bookkeepers, and coastal boat builders. Beneath those victories flowed softer metrics. 900 volunteer hours contributed, 400 cups of chai poured, countless boundaries drawn in ink, now indelible. The report concluded with a projection she had once considered unthinkable. By this time next year, Harborlight will launch satellite clinics in Shelburne, Truro, and Louisbourg. She watched the inked towns glow faintly in lamplight, 3 small constellations poised to map a new hemisphere of agency. From her coat pocket she drew 2 envelopes, each stamped with the lupine and compass emblem Sabrina and Callum had designed. The first, addressed to Mother Kwan, contained a crisp photograph of the lighthouse where the newlyweds now lived 3 days each month, while Callum tested tidal energy turbines. In the foreground, Sabrina stood ankle-deep in winter surf, wool hat, askew, cheeks wind-bright as she held a prototype blade stenciled Grace Fixes Nitrogen. On the back she had scrawled, "This work and this marriage are both anchored in what you taught. Audit the unseen currents. Invest where returns are more than monetary." The second envelope, heavier, held a freshly notarized document transferring 10% of Sabrina's design cooperative profits annually into the Compass Fund. No plea, no guilt, just a ledger line of stewardship freely offered. Marianne cracked the office window. Cold rushed in, smelling of snow-dusted seawater, and the sea glass mosaic downstairs chimed faintly. She placed Henry's compass on the sill, letting the needle twitch beneath persimmon lamplight, then set Sabrina's profit share deed beside it, a tableau of inherited guidance and earned alignment. Beyond the harbour, the foghorn sounded its slow syllable, and she thought of all the unseen women who would steer by Harborlight's glow in the coming year, each setting a course out of shadow economies toward open water. Her phone buzzed, glowing with a message from Julian. "Mom, first paycheck from the co-op tutoring program. Transferring 20% to Harborlight scholarship line tonight. Receipts of kindness kept." She smiled, imagining his proud grin, then set the device face down. Numbers could wait. Intention had already posted to the ledger of the heart. At the edge of the loft stood a slim pine freshly dragged in by volunteers that afternoon, branches still releasing sap's peppery sweetness. Instead of ornaments, it bore the craft tags from the chestnut tree, lessons and wishes now winter-hardened yet still legible. Marianne selected the blank tag, uncapped the felt pen, and wrote in sure script, "Self-respect is the only currency that never devalues. Circulate freely." She looped the twine over a topmost bough, where it twirled beside Julian's keep receipts of kindness and Anita McPhee's star blankets warm every audit trail. Stepping back, she saw that the tree had become a forest of small illuminations, each tag reflecting lamplight the way snow reflects moonbeams, individually modest, collectively radiant. A knock sounded on the stairwell. Martha, cheeks ruddy, bearing thermoses of cocoa and a request to review tomorrow's workshop slides. Marianne nodded, heart settling into that gentle cadence she now recognized as fulfillment, not fatigue. She closed the folio, snuffed the lamp, and carried her compass downstairs, where Harborlight's main room glowed gold and amethyst beneath the mosaic's fractured brilliance. She tucked the compass into its velvet pouch beside Sabrina's deed and Julian's text receipt, then joined Martha at the conference table. Outside, snow thickened, layering the city in hush, but inside the initiative, the air hummed with low conversation and the scratch of markers across poster board, ordinary sounds that, to Marianne's attuned ears, rang like the steady tick of a metronome, guiding a symphony newly scored for dignity. Before turning to the slides, she lifted her mug, lupines, and the phrase, "interest in grace," and offered the simplest toast she knew, words once whispered under a chestnut's lantern glow, now carried into every season, to balance kept, to stories open. The volunteers echoed softly, mugs touching in a constellation of quiet clinks, and somewhere deep in the timber frame, a gust of nor'easter wind set the sea glass mosaic singing, a high crystalline note that lingered like a promise, that as long as Harborlight's lamps burned, North would remain true, accounts of the heart would reconcile in favor of the brave, and compound interest would forever accrue in the one ledger that matters, where generosity and self-respect are recorded side by side, both written in words and neither ever erased.